Gusto nila ipakita dito na inevitable na landslide yung mangyari sa upcoming elections. But as I've been mentioning, if you look at the race, ang dami pang pwedeng curveballs na mangyayari. But in the meantime, certain elements are important through and through. At isa dyan is yung necessity for the Leni camp to actually create not only a strong electoral mobilization campaign, but also a robust movement, no? At yan ang gusto kong pag-usapan today. Now, that kind of brings me to this very famous quote na inattribute kay Count Leo Tolstoy, one of my favorites. As you can see some of his books there at the back, War and Peace, Anna Karenina, among others. And sinabi niya, since corrupt people unite among themselves to constitute a force, ito yung sinabi ni Leo Tolstoy, then honest people must do the same. So if the supporters of the Leni camp believe that they want to be anchors of democratic reform, then kailangan din nila mag-unify, and not unify only as an electoral campaign kind of team, but much more than that, no? So when you talk about movements, hindi lang ito yung mga nasa online lang na maraming trolls or biglang dami likes and shares, no? It goes well beyond that, no? When we talk about a social movement, especially with a political bent and for democratic reform, three elements ang kailangan dyan. And we can discuss how those elements are present pagdating sa the so-called Leni movement. Yung first of all is, of course, dapat it cuts across socio-economic classes and geographic divides. At dito nakikita natin na when it comes to Vice President Leni Robredo, yes, may mga traditional politicians, may mga LGUs, may mga political parties na alam natin saan sila pumupunta. You know, you go where the money is for some of these people, no, not all of them, but yung kasi yung momentum is follow the money for some people, no. At alam natin pagdating sa resources naman medyo kapos ang opposition sa election na ito, no. But no, when you look at yung groundswell of support, yung motorcades na nakikita natin, among others, and even support from some of the local government coalitions, no, or provincial coalitions, nakita natin na it actually cuts across the country from the north to south and across socioeconomic classes. So hindi totoo na yung base lang ni Vice President Leni ay either ABC or E or D. Nakikita natin from poorest regions of the country all the way to Dasmariñas and Forbes. We see all of this, groundswell of support for the Vice President. So clearly my element of cross-sectoral, cross-class, movement ang nakikita natin. But of course, it may have not fully congealed yet, but we see elements of that. But that's exactly what they have to work on, no? Yung pangalawa is the related dun sa sinasabi kanina is yung necessity for having a more strategic long-term approach rather than tactical situational approach, no? At kay Adam Tooze, historian ko na ko in term ng tactical situation. Kasi ang tactical situation ay ganito. How can we get the most number of people in next year elections para manalo tayo? Yan ang tactical situation na. Pero kung strategic long-term ka, at that's what really social movements are all about, ang titignan mo dyan is anong pwede nyong gawin as a political force before, during, and after the election process. Kasi kung ang tingin mo lang yung pwede mong gawin in the election per se, at ang inisip mo lang paano ka manalo, no? At yun lang naman talagang focus mo, then that's not really a movement. That's an electoral calculus. That's just an electoral mobilization tactic, no? But for you to have a movement, you have to go beyond that. You have to create really a robust coalition of forces that will be there to guard certain principles, foundational principles, hindi lang during elections, but also well beyond election process. So movements ang pinag-usapan natin. So kung titingnan niyo, for instance, in Georgia and US, yung movement for electoral reform, it was 10 years in the making before it culminated dun sa victory of Democrats. No, they got 2 senators in last year's elections. No, so you're looking at the long-term reform strategy here. Hindi lang short-term, tactical, situational mobilization for an election. And the third element na dapat titignan natin dito is, and I think I see some element of that also in terms of the conversations and discourses of supporters of the Leni camp na I've come across, is that they understand na kailangan natin ng transformational leadership and transformational reform. Hindi kaya yung tinkering lang with the system or just some cyclical reforms or just some cosmetic change. ang talagang kailangan ng bansa natin are transformational structural reforms, no? To deal with the party systems na totally broken dahil sa political dynasties, to deal with oligopolistic practices sa ating ekonomiya, to deal with issues of national security when it comes to underinvestments in terms of our defensive capabilities, when it comes to dealing with strengthening our judicial institutions and due process. So dapat transformational yung reforms na hiningi, hindi lang yung tactical reforms or yung mga deliverables lang na pwede mo i-deliver within a year, 2 years, or 6 years. No, but you're looking at long-term structural transformation of the country. No. So those three elements are very important for you to have a social movement. And I think all of them, to a certain degree, meron na dun sa support base at saka campaign messaging ni Vice President Leni Robredo. But definitely, it has to be consolidated if, you know, the opposition wants to create really progressive, robust movement, right? To not only defend the vestiges of democracy in the country, but in fact, pwede niya i-restore, no, yung rejuvenate, no, yung ating democratic spirit, no, at saka yung ating mga frayed institutions and make us a much more robust, deep and mature democracy. No, nonetheless, of course, at the same time, I think there are three things that the Leni campaign has to keep in mind if they want more forward. Again, by the way, let me be very clear. I've discussed all different camps here. Last week, marami atang alam natin yung mga na-criticize sa akin because I discussed about the ISCO camp and I wrote a number of articles on ISCO for Nikkei, the National, among others, about ano naman mga strategy nila. So we're looking at strategies here, no? So this is, no, not favoring one side or another. But anyways, let's go back to this. I think there are three things na medyo kailangan improve ng Leni campaign. I mean, the first thing is that clearly it has to go beyond the old liberal clique, no? Now, I understand now, of course, Vice President Leni Robredo is still attached to the Liberal Party, but there's a reason why she chose pink, right, a new color that, you know, and, you know, she didn't run officially under the Liberal Party. And I think she herself recognizes that something has to change here. Now, there's nothing wrong with liberalism per se, right? But the old style clique liberalism is just not going to work. It just lost its luster among Filipino people. That's absolutely true. And this is just how politics works. You have to reinvent, right? Every generation or so. Come up with new narrative, new strategies, new personality, new faces. So in that sense, siguro yung campaign talaga nila will have to embrace a broad coalition of sincere reformists, intellectuals, and progressives from labor groups, from the academe, from civil society groups, etc. Yun dapat well beyond yung just old liberal critique. I'm not gonna name names, I'm not gonna mention anything like that because this is not what we're gonna do here. Hindi naman tayo marites style. Sinasabi ko lang the old style liberalism just doesn't cut it anymore. You have to broaden your base, no? And that's why sinabi ko siguro dapat may conversations with the labor groups among others like Sira Calyodi, with academics, intellectuals, with progressives, now who are not necessarily a fan of the whole old style liberalism, but they're fundamentally liberal in a sense na naniniwala sila sa demokrasya, human rights, due process, and socioeconomic justice. Yun ang napakamahalaga. Second thing to keep in mind is some of the supporters of the campaign, and you know the campaign in general, has to go beyond. I'm not saying they're doing this, but there's some supporters who kind of project this in kind of purism, na ina-attack anyone else na hindi necessarily tumutugma dun sa kanilang ideological expectations, no? You know, for me, in fairness, you know, to Vice President Leni Robredo, she has been realistic enough to put people like Binay, Vice President Binay, among others, in her coalition, right? So if you want to play the purism game, then let's go, right? So I think she has been realistic enough. But some of her supporters sometimes kind of project this kind of a, you know, I don't want to use it virtue signaling, but clearly my cancel culture element. Now, anyone who doesn't support them, supports anyone else, I either trapo, misogynist, etc. I'm not saying all of her supporters, but there's some people who kind of make that statement. So it's very important na hindi ang dating ng campaign nila is yung parang cancel culture, virtue signaling, etc. I'm not saying that's the case, but it's important some of the core supporters don't do that because that gives a wrong impression and drives away some of the people who maybe you know, attracted by the message of Leni Robredo, maybe are considering her given her own personal track record. But when they see some of her supporters do this kind of, you know, ideological posturing and etc., it turns them off because there are a lot of voters who just want decent, competent, conscientious leadership. And they're not very much into this ideological debate. So para sa kanila, siguro this might kind of alienate them. So mahalaga na it goes beyond purism, but still the fundamental convictions and red lines should be clear, no? So that can be done in a non-judgmental, non-virtue signaling way, right? So I think that's a very important thing. The third thing and the last thing is that, yes, while there has to be an emphasis on human rights, there has to be an emphasis in preventing another martial law, about highlighting yung mga horrors of martial law. Mahalaga na, as I mentioned, no, there has to be also focus on socioeconomic rights, land reform, labor rights, no, endo, yung mga ganitong issue. Kasi mahalaga yan, especially dun sa mga marginalized sectors of the society. And at the same time, no, as I said, dun sa isang analysis ko na, kailangan din i-up yung cool factor. Hindi pa cool, but cool factor in the sense that when you do your messaging and all, you know, it has to show a Leni that is, you know, fresh and energized and inspiring, etc. Right? Because especially mahalaga yan dun sa mga media-savvy sections of the voters, especially younger voters. At kita natin yung strength ng other campaigns like the Bongbong Marcos campaign is yung cool factor ay napakalakas. So yung may hatak yan sa mga youth, no? But that's it, eh. You know, as Socrates said, you have to seduce people with the truth. Kung wala kang cool factor, people won't even pay attention to you no matter how good your message is. So mahalaga na ayusin mo yung message mo at yung candidate mo ang strong, fresh and all at hindi yung mga eye bags na ganun, no? Mahalaga yan. But as I said, it has to go also beyond emphasizing political rights alone. As important as human rights, political rights, among others are, mahalaga din dito, no, yung issue ng socio-economic justice. So yan. So in short, recap tayo dun sa mga late sa class, no? So there are three elements to the social movement, no? First of all, dapat it has to cut across different socio-economic classes and geographic divides, hindi lang solid north, hindi lang solid south, hindi lang Bicol, etc. Mahalaga na iba't ibang sectors at mga Pilipino from different ethno-linguistic background can relate to that candidate and the message and the values. Pangalawa, ang mahalaga po dito is dapat ang approach ay strategic long-term, hindi lang situational, tactical, just for winning the elections. Dapat ang thinking mo is that you have to create a movement that will stay there way beyond the election date no matter what's the result, right? Because if you really believe in reform, long-term reform, hindi ito one-time, big time. Hindi lang ito 6-year term, no? It goes well beyond that. Right? So you have to have long-term strategic commitment, hindi lang tactical mobilization strategy for election period alone, no? So you have to go beyond that. And the third element, of course, na dapat pag-usapan natin is the need for transformational, structural reforms, policy reforms, dun sa issue ng political parties, how to deal with dynasties, dun sa issue ng industrial and trade policy, land reform, many problems, deficiency dito, meron dito sa ating demokrasya, dapat ayusin natin. So yun ang dapat approach ng movements. Now, in terms of siguro yung mga areas na pwede mag-improve ng mga Leni campaign, I think there are three areas, as I mentioned. First of all, it has to be much more broad-based, both in terms of the people they work with, the people they get the advice with, the people they get their ideas from. It has to go beyond that old-style liberal clique. No, mahalaga yan. The second element is important, that instead of projecting purism, I'm not saying that's the case, but I think it's better to emphasize a kind of a ideologically appealing or, you know, so the convictions should be clear, no question about that. But at the same time, at the same time, yung cancel culture ay dapat medyo siguro i-mitigate yan, because this is turning off a lot of not so ideological voters who may like the candidate, in this case Leni, but are kind of turned off by some of the purist posturing of some of her supporters. Not all, but some of her supporters. So I think mahalaga dito na, you know, you make the candidate appealing to as many people as possible, beyond just playing this virtue signaling games. Again, I'm not saying this is what Leni campaign is doing per se, but it's important that's not the impression. Because the reality is that some people have that impression, right? We can discuss about that, and that impression perhaps should be corrected. And lastly, yes, as I said, mahalaga yung may cool factor, because yun yung meron dun sa mga ibang candidates, especially with the Marcos campaign, daming cool factor dyan. And this is important dun sa hatak sa mga younger voters, because you have to get people's attention first before you give them the right message, otherwise, diba? So that's why I mentioned Socrates' quote, you have to seduce people with the truth. But, mas mahalaga pa dyan, no, yung emphasis on socio-economic rights. Because mahalaga ito dun sa mga marginalized sectors, mga farmers, indigenous peoples, labor groups, etc. So as important as due process and human rights and all of those issues are, they are absolutely important. Dapat ini-emphasize yung issue ng endo, labor rights, land reform, yung mga ganun, yung mga karapatan ng mga indigenous people groups. So, dapat non-compromising sa mga issue na yan, and very clear yung messaging, no, in order to build the kind of broad-based coalition and movement that is necessary. Because the reality is that, short of that, we might enter, the latter half of what you can call a Marcosian century. So for the past